What if tomorrow's headlines suddenly announced that Canada had just discovered the largest oil reserve in the entire world? Bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Venezuela, bigger than anything anyone had ever imagined before. Imagine the shock waves this would send across the planet. Energy markets would erupt, governments would panic, investors would scramble, and Canada, a country already blessed with natural resources, would find itself holding the single most powerful energy card humanity has ever seen. Sounds like the plot of a blockbuster movie, right? But let's pause and really think through it, because if such a discovery ever happened, the consequences would reach every corner of the globe. And the story of Canada itself would be rewritten in ways that might surprise you. Stick with us, because this what-if scenario will take us through power, politics, money, environment, and even the future of global order. And before we go deeper, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because if you're curious about the hidden stories of countries, resources, and what shapes our world, you won't want to miss what's coming next. So let's start simple. Canada is already a big player in oil. Most people know about the Alberta oil sands, those massive reserves of bitumen that have helped make Canada one of the top producers on Earth. In fact, right now, Canada has the third largest proven oil reserves in the world, after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. That alone makes it a heavyweight in global energy. But what we're imagining here goes way beyond that. This isn't about being third place or even second place. This is about Canada suddenly jumping to number one, and not just by a little margin, but by holding a reserve so massive that it dwarfs the rest. Think of it like this. Instead of holding 170 billion barrels, which is where Canada stands today, imagine Canada sitting on 1 trillion barrels of recoverable oil, enough to supply the world for generations, enough to change every calculation in geopolitics. Now here's the big question. What happens next? The answer isn't simple, and it doesn't move in a straight line. Because oil is not just fuel. Oil is money. Oil is power. Oil is leverage. And oil is also controversy. To understand how this would reshape Canada and the world, we need to break it down, from economics to global alliance, to the environment, and even to how everyday Canadians would feel about suddenly living in the world's biggest oil state. Let's begin with the global stage. For over a century, the balance of power in energy has revolved around the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and later Venezuela have controlled the world's largest reserves, giving them influence far beyond their borders. The United States built much of its foreign policy around securing oil. Wars were fought, alliances were made, and trillions of dollars changed hands, all because of who had the biggest reserves. If Canada suddenly rose to the top of this pyramid, that balance would collapse. The entire global oil order would shift north. Washington would no longer look across the Atlantic or the Persian Gulf for its most critical energy partner. It would look directly across its northern border. The US and Canada already share the world's largest trading relationship, but this discovery would supercharge it. America would be desperate to ensure that Canadian oil stayed in friendly hands. Every president, every Pentagon strategist, every diplomat would have to recalculate their plans with one thing in mind: how to keep Canada close. But here's the twist. Canada is not Saudi Arabia. It's not Venezuela. It's not a monarchy or a state where oil revenue flows into the hands of a few. Canada is a democracy with strong institutions, complex provinces, and a population that has long wrestled with the environmental costs of oil. That makes this scenario fascinating because the question becomes, how would a democratic, environmentally conscious, but resource-rich country handle being the center of global energy power? Would Canada embrace the oil rush, drilling and exporting on a massive scale? Or would internal debates between provinces, between indigenous groups, between environmentalists and industry hold it back? Let's zoom in on economics for a moment. Oil doesn't just fuel cars and planes, it fuels entire economies. If Canada held the world's largest reserve, money would pour in on a scale never seen before. We're talking about hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars, flooding into Canadian coffers over decades. Provinces like Alberta, already shaped by oil wealth, would see unimaginable booms. Ottawa, the federal government, would suddenly have access to revenues that could erase debts, fund massive social programs, and transform infrastructure. Think universal childcare paid for by oil wealth, high-speed rail across the country, cutting-edge healthcare with no waiting lines, or even the creation of a sovereign wealth fund like Norway's, but on a far larger scale. Norway today has over $1 trillion saved from its oil. Imagine Canada building something several times bigger, a fund that could ensure prosperity for generations, even after the oil ran out. But money doesn't just bring opportunity, it also brings problems. Economists talk about something called the resource curse, where countries rich in natural resources often struggle with corruption, inequality, and unstable economies. Could Canada fall victim to this? Would provinces start fighting over who controls the oil revenues? Would political parties split into camps, one pushing for maximum drilling, another demanding strict limits? Would Indigenous communities, whose lands often overlap with resource-rich areas, demand a larger share of the wealth, or resist development altogether to protect their environment and sovereignty? These are not simple questions, and in many ways, they define whether this discovery became a blessing or a curse. Now let's think globally again. The discovery of a giant Canadian reserve wouldn't just shake the oil market, it would terrify other oil states. Saudi Arabia, for example, has built its entire global influence on being the swing producer of oil. Its wealth, its political power, even its ambitious Vision 2030 plan to diversify the economy, all depend on oil dominance. If Canada suddenly eclipsed it, Saudi Arabia's influence would shrink. OPEC, the powerful cartel of oil-producing countries, would lose its grip. Imagine OPEC meetings where Canada isn't just at the table, it's the head of the table, with reserves too large for anyone else to challenge. Venezuela, already struggling with crisis, would see its one advantage erased. Russia, another major oil exporter, would lose leverage over Europe. In fact, Europe itself might pivot away from Middle Eastern and Russian energy and look across the Atlantic to Canada, investing in pipelines, ports, and partnerships. This discovery wouldn't just be about Canada getting richer, it would rewrite global alliances. NATO, G7, the G20, all would shift, with Canada suddenly becoming not just a polite middle power, but a true global heavyweight. But let's not forget the elephant in the room: climate change. Oil may be power, but it's also pollution. Burning fossil fuels is the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. And right now, the world is trying, slowly, painfully, to transition away from oil and toward renewables. If Canada suddenly held the largest reserve, it would face a massive dilemma. On one hand, the economic pressure to extract and sell that oil would be enormous. On the other hand, Canadians themselves are among the most climate-aware populations in the world. Would the country risk becoming the villain of climate change, pushing out oil just as the world needs to cut back? Or would Canada take a unique path, using the discovery not just for wealth, but as a bargaining chip to lead the global transition? Imagine this: Canada decides to keep much of the oil in the ground, but uses its status as oil king to drive investment in green technology. It could say to the world, "We have the oil, but we'll only release it if it's truly needed. And in the meantime, we'll use the wealth to fund the clean energy future." That's a scenario no oil-rich country has ever attempted, and it could give Canada a kind of moral leadership that matches its resource power. And then there's ordinary life. What would this discovery mean for everyday Canadians? At first, it might look like a golden age. Jobs would skyrocket, especially in construction, energy, and related industries. Wages might rise. Governments could fund better services. But oil booms also bring inflation, housing shortages, and social divides. Cities in oil-rich regions might see housing prices explode. Provinces without oil might feel left out, and the national conversation would shift. Instead of debating healthcare wait times or hockey rivalries, Canadians might find themselves debating pipelines, exports, and foreign policy. It would be a cultural shift as much as an economic one. So, let's recap the first layer of this thought experiment. Canada discovers the largest oil reserve in the world. The immediate impact is global shock. Markets shift, alliances change, money floods in, and Canada's role in the world transforms overnight. But beneath the excitement lies a much harder story. How to balance wealth with responsibility, how to avoid the resource curse, how to manage the clash between oil and climate, and how to handle the weight of new global expectations. This isn't just about oil. It's about what kind of country Canada would choose to become in the face of unimaginable power. And that's only the beginning. Because in the next parts, we'll dig deeper. How history shows us what happens to nations that suddenly find oil, how Canada's institutions might cope, how Indigenous communities could shape the outcome, how rival powers might try to interfere, and even what a Canada-led energy world might look like. So stay tuned, because this story is just getting started.